Thank you very much. First, let me thank Congresswoman Kelly and Congressman Payne for organizing this special order and for your continued leadership on so many vital issues and for staying the course and holding down the fort for the Congressional Black Caucus. So important that our message of unity and our message, which really describes what many of the issues are that all of our communities are faced with, that message go out, and both of you have really been tremendous in this effort. And so I rise this evening to join this critical conversation on race relations in America and to challenge our colleagues to work with the Congressional Black Caucus to realize progress for racial justice and equality. And I join first with Congresswoman Kelly and Payne in sending my condolences to the families and the victims of the horrific terrorist attack in Paris, in Lebanon, in Nigeria, and also in Egypt. And know that we join in this quest for global peace and security throughout the world. Now, tonight's special order is an important part of our work to address the discrimination and racism that still plagues our nation, specifically as it relates to African Americans, but we know that it impacts all communities of color. It's manifested in many ways, and it affects our entire country. As Congressman Payne said so eloquently, we are the United States. And so when one is affected, all is affected. All across the country, at universities like Mizzou and Yale, and places like Baltimore and Ferguson, and in high schools like Spring Valley High in Columbia, South Carolina, we are witnessing the painful impact of institutional racism in our communities. Very recently, we saw this in my home district at Berkeley High School, in one of the most progressive and enlightened cities in the country. Black students were subjected to threatening messages on campus, but I'm so proud of the students at Berkeley. They walked off, and it was not only black students, it was all students, and marched down peacefully through the city to protest these terrible, despicable messages. This is unacceptable. All students have a right to learn free from violence and from threats. As long as black students and any student of color feels unsafe in their classrooms, our work for justice remains incomplete. And this crisis isn't limited to our schools. Tragically, people of color face institutional racism from the moment they are born. According to a report released earlier this year by the Joint Economic Committee and the Congressional Black Caucus, more than 1 in 3 black children are born into poverty. This cycle of poverty and inequality continues in our school systems, where black students account for 42% of preschool student expulsions, mind you. Now, that's preschool. That's students, from about 2 years old to 4 years old. 42% of preschool student expulsions, despite accounting for only 18% of enrollment. First, I can't figure out how any student aged 2 to 4 is expelled from school. That's outrageous. Yet 42% of preschool student expulsions are African American babies. These kids don't even get a start, let alone a head start. Outside of the classroom, African Americans are over-policed, over-criminalized, and underemployed. A report published by the New York Times in April found that there are an estimated 1.5 million black men between ages 24 to 54 who are missing from civic life, just missing. These missing men, who account for 1 in every 6 black men, have been victims of mass incarceration or premature death. And this crisis of inequality extends to the structures of the community and have persisted from generations. Over the past 4 decades, the average unemployment rate for blacks has been double the rate for white Americans. For many black families, it feels like this is a permanent recession. Mr. Speaker, this must be our call to action. That's why I'm so proud of our young people throughout the country and students who are standing up to racism and injustice in their communities. It's time for Congress to listen to the young people, saying that black lives matter and black students matter. Earlier this month, I held a forum on racial justice in my district to address these issues. More than 300 East Bay residents from all backgrounds attended and raised their voices for justice. This was the second forum that I've held throughout the last 3 months. Now, I've been able to reach over 1,000 East Bay residents. And so tonight, in this dialogue, which Congressman Payne and Congresswoman Kelly had talked about, dialogue leads to action. And hopefully our colleagues would think about hosting these types of forums and listen to what people are saying, listen to what the impact of some of our policies are on their daily lives. We must be part of the conversation and the solution, but we must listen. We must hear the pain and the suffering that people are experiencing as a result of discrimination and racial injustice. Now, the Congress must act to start addressing the systemic racism that degrades our institutions and threatens our communities. It's past time for us to get serious about addressing the lack of opportunity for black and minority families in this country. Right now, today, in this chamber, there's legislation that can start moving the needle forward. We need to empower our communities to build greater trust between law enforcement and communities of color. And we need to address chronic recidivism, which would be a huge step towards returning some of our missing men to their families and communities. To do this, Congress should pass the Safe Justice Act, sponsored by Congressman Sensenbrenner and Congressman Scott. Congress should also pass the Stop Militarization Law Enforcement Act, that's H.R. 1232, to stop the militarization of our nation's police forces. We also should pass the Police Accountability Act, that's H.R. 1102, and the Grand Jury Reform Act, H.R. 429, so we can ensure that deadly force cases are heard by a judge and that there's more accountability for police officers. As we reform our broken criminal justice system and work to help repair those families hurt by mass incarceration, we will be strengthening America. We will have people who really can make a contribution not only to their families and their communities, but to the entire country. The federal government shouldn't continue to put up barriers to work for those trying to rebuild their lives after making a mistake. Ban the box totally by federal contractors and by federal agencies. We also need to repeal the lifetime ban on Pell Grants for those formerly incarcerated as it relates to drug felonies, the ineligibility for life for public assistance and food stamps. We need to remove these barriers so that people of color, primarily African American men and Latino men, can get back into society, get a job, and take care of their families. Once again, this is an example of public policy that racism rears its ugly head in our own institutions and policies. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we must address the poverty that plagues communities of color all across the country. We have the WIP's Task Force on Poverty, Income Inequality, and Opportunity, which I am proud to chair with Congressman, our WIP, Mr. Hoyer. We're working with more than 100 of our colleagues now to advance policies that give all families, including African American families, living below the poverty line, both in urban communities and in rural communities. We want to give everyone a fair shot. This includes our Half in 10 Act, H.R. 258, which calls for a national strategy to cut poverty in half in the next decade. That's more than 22 million Americans lifted out of poverty into the middle class in just the next 10 years by being strategic and coordinating our existing programs. Our Pathway Out of Poverty Act, H.R. 2721. This would create good-paying jobs that will lift families out of poverty into the middle class while strengthening our safety net for those who are still struggling. Ultimately, the only way to end institutional racism is to give African Americans and people of color a seat at the table. And we need to pass legislation and policies that begin to remove these barriers. My mentor, the Honorable Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, she used to say, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring in a folding chair. And that's what our young people are doing around the country. So I want to thank all of the people across our country who are bringing in folding chairs and ensuring that these important conversations happen. We hear you, we support you, and we will keep fighting for you. For ensuring liberty and justice for all means just that. It means for all. And in doing so, we will make the United States a stronger country. And so thank you, Congresswoman Kelly and Congressman Payne, for organizing this very important special order. And I know out of this discussion, we are laying out what can be done, and it doesn't take another generation to end racial injustice.